You might take that soft, comforting roll of toilet paper for granted. The gentle crinkle as you pull it off, the clean swipe, the flush, and you're done. But for most of human history, wiping your behind was a dangerous, filthy gamble, and sometimes it could even kill you. Imagine squatting in the cold, damp corners of a medieval hut, stomach churning after a questionable stew, reaching for what? A handful of straw, a jagged shard of clay, maybe a communal sponge that's been soaking in rancid vinegar, used by the last 5 people before you. You'd better hope you don't have a cut back there, because infection could mean a slow, feverish death from something as simple as trying to stay clean. The truth is, even history's greatest heroes, emperors, warriors, kings in gilded halls, had to wipe. Alexander the Great might have conquered Persia, but he still had to crouch in the dirt and hope a handful of leaves would get the job done. The knights of the Crusades slaughtered thousands, but they still had to figure out how to clean up after a particularly bad meal on the road to Jerusalem. Throughout history, the humble act of wiping has been anything but humble. It has been disgusting, improvisational, and sometimes horrifying. And the methods people used were, let's just say, not what you'd want near your most sensitive places. Because while the world was building pyramids, waging wars, and discovering new lands, people were also trying not to get splinters where the sun doesn't shine. Tonight, we're diving into a story of human history that is dark, bizarre, and honestly, a little gross. But it's a story worth telling, because the struggle to stay clean is as old as humanity itself. Imagine walking into a Roman public latrine. The air is heavy with the scent of vinegar, stale sweat, and the acrid tang of human waste baking under the Mediterranean sun. Rows of stone benches line the walls, each with a hole carved into it, and beneath, a flowing stream attempts, futilely, to carry away the evidence of hundreds of daily visitors. In your hand, you clutch what the Romans considered advanced hygiene as a tussorium, a communal sponge tied to the end of a stick. It is wet, dripping with a mixture of vinegar and salt water. You might try not to think about who used it before you. A merchant with diarrhea after bad fish. A soldier with festering wounds from the last skirmish. A child, a beggar, a senator. A sponge didn't care. The tussorium was shared by everyone. The poor, the wealthy, the sick, the dying. In the best circumstances, you might rinse it in a bucket of vinegar or salt water that sat nearby, already murky from countless rinses. In the worst, you might not even bother. You would brace yourself, do your business on the cold stone, and reach for the sponge, hoping you wouldn't catch something that would kill you in a few days, weeks, or months. It wasn't just about discomfort or the risk of a rash. Infections were common, spreading from one behind to another with ruthless efficiency. Hemorrhoids were made worse by the abrasive texture of the sponge, and the bacteria from dozens of strangers could find their way into tiny cuts, leading to infections that had no real cure in a world before antibiotics. Imagine dying of sepsis, your body rotting from the inside, simply because you needed to wipe. The Greeks weren't much better off, though their method was uniquely brutal. In the bustling cities of Athens, amidst the debates of philosophers and the construction of great temples, people still had to wipe, their tool of choice. Small, rounded clay shards called pessoi. Think of a piece of broken pottery. Edges smoothed down just enough not to slice you open, but still hard, cold, and utterly unforgiving. These pessoi were often inscribed with the names of enemies, a darkly humorous form of revenge as you wipe them away. But imagine the discomfort of pressing a clay shard against yourself, the sharp coldness of terracotta, scraping against tender skin. A small crack, a jagged edge, an overzealous swipe, and you could open a cut that might become infected. Parasites, bacteria, and the ever-present threat of poor sanitation turned each trip to relieve yourself into a potential death sentence. Meanwhile, in China, they were ahead of much of the world in many ways, including hygiene. By the 6th century, early forms of toilet paper were being used, made from rice straw and other plant fibers. But this luxury was not for everyone. The wealthy could afford the softness of paper, while the poor still relied on sticks, bamboo scrapers, or handfuls of water and whatever else was available. These early papers were rough, more like today's packing paper than the soft, quilted luxury you're used to. Imagine thin, coarse paper scraping, sometimes leaving splinters or bits behind, and sometimes it simply wasn't enough to get the job done. Even when you had paper, you had to be careful. Paper was valuable, and people would use it sparingly, often were using it if it wasn't too soiled. Up in the cold, misty lands of the north, the Vikings had their own brutal methods. These fierce warriors who sailed the seas, raided monasteries, and carved out kingdoms, still had to wipe. Their choices: moss, sheep's wool, or sometimes snow. Moss, while soft and absorbent, was not always dry. And if you grabbed the wrong patch, you might end up smearing mud or insects, along with your business. Sheep's wool was a luxury, and often reserved for those of higher status, and snow, well, it might leave you clean, but it would also leave you shivering, gasping as the icy bite made you question your life choices. Imagine waking up on a frosty morning, the steam of your breath visible, the call of nature impossible to ignore, and having to crouch in the snow, using a handful of icy slush to clean yourself. It was effective, but it could leave you numb and raw, a harsh reminder of the realities of life in the north. Across these civilizations, communal wiping tools were a reality. Whether it was the Roman sponge dipped again and again into the same bucket of sour liquid, the Greek shards shared between family members, or the Chinese bamboo scrapers washed and reused, the idea of personal hygiene was vastly different from what you know today. There was no privacy, no personal roll of soft, scented paper, no flush to wash it all away. You were surrounded by others, sitting side by side, the sounds, the smells, the discomfort inescapable. You didn't wipe to feel clean, you wiped just enough to continue with your day, hoping it wouldn't lead to sores, infections, or the wrath of parasites waiting to invade your body. Because in the ancient world, wiping was not about comfort or dignity. It was about survival, about doing the bare minimum to avoid disease, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. And so, the next time you reach for that soft roll, remember the Romans with their communal sponge, the Greeks with their shards of pottery, the Chinese scraping with bamboo, and the Vikings with their handfuls of moss or snow. Remember that even emperors, warriors, and kings had to figure out how to clean themselves with whatever they could find. And that history, for all its glory, is often much filthier than we like to admit. Picture it: the mud, churned streets of a medieval village, chickens darting between piles of horse dung, the air heavy with the smoke of peat fires, rotting fish, and sweat. In this world, where disease stalked every muddy corner, people still had to wipe. And let me tell you, it was rarely pleasant, and almost never clean. For the vast majority, peasants, serfs, the poor who toiled in fields from dawn until dusk, the tools of hygiene were whatever nature provided. You woke before the sun to milk the cow, your hands already cracked and raw, your stomach rumbling from last night's barley gruel, and you felt the familiar, urgent churn that told you it was time. But there were no bathrooms, no privacy, no comforting sound of a flushing toilet. Instead, you trudged to the edge of the village, behind a hedge or to the midden heap, where the community's waste was already piled high, and squatted over the cold, damp earth, praying it wouldn't collapse beneath you. When it came time to wipe, you reached for leaves, hay, straw, or grass. Whatever was within reach. Leaves could be soft, if you were lucky, but misjudge your grab in the pre-dawn darkness, and you might end up with something spiny or crawling with bugs, pressed into places you'd rather keep untouched. Straw was the most common, but it was rough, coarse, and brittle, and you could easily get a splinter in the worst place possible. And yes, that happened more often than you would think. A tiny sliver of straw lodged where the sun doesn't shine could fester, leading to infections, boils, and sores that would throb painfully as you worked, reminding you of your misfortune with every step. Grass was softer, but you'd need a handful, and in wet weather, it would smear rather than clean, leaving you damp and uncomfortable, with the lingering scent of your own mess clinging to you. As you returned to the fields to work, you would feel it with every movement, the irritation, the itch, the discomfort that could do nothing about. For the wealthier classes, nobles, wealthy merchants, minor lords, the situation was marginally better, but even then, it was far from comfortable. The wealthy sometimes used scraps of linen or wool, remnants from clothing too worn to repair, cut into small squares for use. Wool was softer, and linen was absorbent, but it was still precious in a world where textiles were labor, intensive to produce and expensive to replace. Using cloth was rare, and if you were in a castle or a wealthy home, it might be washed and reused, passed from servant to servant, or between family members. If you think sharing a bathroom with siblings is bad, imagine sharing your wiping cloth. And the laundering process was itself less than perfect, washed in cold water with lye or harsh soap, hung to dry in the open air, where flies and dust would cling to it, ready to be used again. In castles and wealthier homes, chamber pots were the primary toilet, simple ceramic or metal bowls, tucked under beds or in corners. After relieving yourself, you had to decide how to clean up. Some used water poured from a jug, a rag. Chamber pots were emptied into cesspits or thrown out windows onto the streets, adding to the rivers of filth that carried human waste down the roads where people walked daily, including barefoot children and animals. The smell was constant, inescapable, part of life. You could not hide from it, and when you wiped, you were adding your contribution to the shared stench of medieval life. Poor hygiene wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Cuts from rough materials or wiping with dirty hands could become infected. Parasites thrived, with lice and fleas infesting clothing and hair, and worms finding their way into bodies already weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to filth. Flies that had landed on waste would crawl over food, spreading diseases like dysentery and typhoid. When outbreaks of plague arrived, they found a population already weakened, their immune systems battered by constant infections. The connection between poor hygiene and disease was poorly understood, and most people believed bad smells caused illness, not the filth itself, so cleaning habits rarely changed. Yet, this was normal. Children learned from a young age to use straw and leaves, to wipe quickly, and return to work. Women in long dresses and men in woolen tunics carried the faint scent of their own waste wherever they went, masked by perfumes or herbs if they could afford them, but never truly removed. It was a world where wiping was an act of survival, done just well enough to avoid immediate discomfort, with the constant risk of disease or injury lurking in the simplest, most private moments of life. So the next time you sit on your toilet, soft roll in hand, warm water and soap waiting, think of the medieval peasant crouched in the mud, clutching a handful of straw, praying it wouldn't splinter, and hoping they would long enough to worry about it again tomorrow. Because for all the knights, castles, and grand feasts you imagine, when you think of the medieval world, remember this: every single one of them still had to wipe. And it was never as clean as the story'd have you believe. Imagine it. You're in the dense forests of colonial America, a log cabin creaking in the cold wind. Your stomach twisted from a meal of questionable stew, and nature calls. You step outside, boots sinking into the mud, mosquitoes buzzing in your ears, the scent of smoke and damp earth in the air. What do you reach for? A soft roll of toilet paper? Not a chance. You grab a dried corn cob. Yes, the same corn you've eaten for dinner. The cobs left behind once the kernels are gone, dried and rough, became the wiping tool of choice for many settlers and farmers. The cob was readily available, durable, and could be washed and reused, assuming you had the stomach to clean it after use. Imagine squatting behind the cabin, gripping a rough, knobby cob, scraping yourself clean in the cold morning air. Splinters weren't just a possibility, they were inevitable. The abrasive surface left you raw, but the colonists valued practicality over comfort. Some even hung a string of cobs in outhouses, reusable wiping tools, shared among family and guests, each person using it, wiping away their waste, then hanging it back on the string for the next unfortunate soul. It wasn't luxurious, but it was better than nothing, and nothing was often the alternative. Move from the cold forests to coastal villages, where the ocean's breeze carried salt and fish stink, and you'll find other strange solutions. For those living by the sea, seashells and smooth stones became the toilet paper of choice. Imagine picking up a clam shell, still crusted with salt and sand, and pressing it against yourself to scrape away what needed to be scraped away. It was cold, hard, and could crack if you weren't careful, cutting you in the most sensitive of places. Stones were chosen for their smoothness, but smooth in the hand didn't always mean gentle on the skin. One wrong angle, one chip, and you might find yourself bleeding. A small wound ready to fester in a world where soap was a luxury and infections a death sentence. In tropical regions, coconut shells found a similar use. The fibrous husk could be split and used to wipe, scraping away waste, but leaving behind fine fibers, itchy and irritating, sticking to sweat-drenched skin in the humid heat. It was efficient, it was available, and it was utterly uncomfortable. Now, travel north, where snow blanketed the ground in silence and frost, and wiping took on a new horror. The call of nature came whether you liked it or not, and when the world was frozen solid, so were your wiping options. Snow became toilet paper. Cold, biting. A shock that sent shivers through your spine. It was nature's way of ensuring you were awake during the process. It was clean, at least, and could be molded into a soft pad. But the cold was unbearable. Imagine crouching in a snowdrift, the icy burn numbing you, leaving your skin red and raw, frost clinging to hair and skin, the bitter cold making you gasp as you hurried to finish before your skin went numb. It was effective, but it was brutal, and for those who lived in the far north, it was often the only option in a world of ice and silence. On ships at sea, or in the cramped stone corridors of castles, shared hygiene was a grim reality. Shared cloth rags, hung on hooks or kept in buckets, were the wiping tools of the day. A sailor on a creaking wooden ship, battling the stench of fish, bilge water, and sweat, would head to the ship's head, toilet, relieve himself, and reach for a rag damp with salt water, used by dozens before him, stiff with salt and filth. It was rinsed occasionally in barrels of sea water, but never truly cleaned. And it would be used again and again, spreading infections and rashes, making the harsh life at sea even more miserable. In castles, servants and lords alike sometimes used shared rags, washed occasionally, hung to dry in drafty rooms where dust and flies collected, ready to transfer their filth the moment the rag touched skin. The wealthy might have access to softer cloth, but even then, washing was laborious, and these rags were often used beyond their reasonable lifespan. And then, there were those who didn't wipe at all. Yes, in many places and times, wiping was a luxury or a concern that simply wasn't prioritized. Some people, especially in poverty, simply did their business, pulled their garments back into place, and moved on. Washing might come later if water was available, but often it didn't. This was particularly common in times of war, famine, or siege, where the priority was survival, not comfort. Imagine the stench of unwashed bodies in crowded refugee camps. the air thick with the smell of human waste, the constant risk of disease, the knowledge that you might die tomorrow from hunger or violence. So wiping simply became a forgotten concern. You think your bathroom trips are a nightmare. Try living in a world where every squat over a pit or a creak of a chamber pot was a gamble between life and a slow, rotting death. Because the truth is, wiping wasn't the end of the problem. It was the start. Imagine a world where constant itching, burning, and the stench of slow infection became background noise. Where sores formed in places you could not reach or treat. Where sitting down after relieving yourself meant wincing, feeling the rawness, the tenderness, the skin rubbed thin by days of scraping with leaves, straw or whatever you could find. You'd think you could wash it away. But water was often a filthy, bacteria-ridden broth, and washing with it only drove filth deeper into your wounds. Hemorrhoids were your lifelong companions. You couldn't pop a pill or get a comfortable cushion. Instead, you had to keep moving, working the fields or marching in war. While the constant friction and infection made every step a reminder of your body's betrayal. Infections didn't announce themselves with a polite fever. They arrived with angry, swelling flesh, the seep of pus, and the creeping scent of decay. A tiny tear from rough moss or a careless scrape from straw could become a festering ulcer, turning your life into a series of fevers, shivers, and whispers of prayers at night that you'd live to see the morning. And the parasites, fleas, lice, worms, always there, crawling, feeding. Poor wiping practices made them flourish, spreading from body to body, leaving behind bloated bellies, constant hunger, and the uncomfortable squirm under your skin as the worms grew inside you. Your community became your greatest threat. Shared rags, shared sponges, and shared water meant shared diseases. Dysentery didn't care if you were a peasant or a priest. It tore through villages, leaving people doubled over with cramps, dehydrated from endless, bloody diarrhea, wiping themselves raw until they could wipe no more. Sometimes, a simple scratch became a death sentence. The skin splits, bacteria enter, and there is no savior, no antibiotics. Just the slow spread of redness, the heat of infection, the scent turning foul as the wound blackens. Amputation in the best case, death in the worst. And you would die not as a hero in battle, not as a respected elder, but as another nameless victim of bad wiping. And yet, this was life. People kept going because they had to, carrying the constant discomfort, the rawness, the quiet dread that the next wipe might be the one that went wrong. Because before toilet paper, hygiene was a battlefield, and your own body was the front line. So, the next time you tear off a soft square and sigh in relief, remember this: history isn't just dark. Sometimes it's painfully, disgustingly dark. And even the small mercy of wiping safely was a privilege most never knew.